Hello, everyone, and welcome back to AUDIOACUHO, where we connect housing professionals to discuss topics, current events, and trends that are related to you. I'm Jay Copeland,
And I'm Ryan Doherty.
and we'll be your OACU for the show. Today, we've got Natalie Allan from Carleton University with us, and we'll be talking about the curricular approach to learning within residence.
So Natalie is the Assistant Director of Residence Life Services at Carleton University. Natalie was a past faculty member with the ACPA Institute for the Curricular Approach and has supported a variety of institutions in adopting the curricular approach. We're lucky to have Natalie within OACUO to share her experience and knowledge with us, and we're happy that she's joining us today. So why don't we jump in, Natalie? For those that don't know, what is a curricular approach?
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. So a curricular approach is when you think about the learning you want students to have in residence or learning beyond the classroom. It doesn't necessarily have to be residence life related or residence related. It can be anything student affairs or higher ed. But it's the learning that's going to happen in those sort of situations. The other part of it is that we're trying to be intentional how you're planning and promoting those learning experiences, and you're trying to create an environment where students can kind of discover and construct the knowledge for themselves, and so that they are creating their own learning opportunities. You're giving them some learning opportunities, and really it's just being thoughtful and intentional of how that happens. The other part of it is that there are some principles for the curricular approach, and everything that you do when you're taking a curricular approach to residence falls back to the mission, the vision, the values of your institution. And what's really good about that is that the way that we do curriculum here and our learning outcomes and our learning goals here at Carleton will be different from another institution, because another institution's mission, vision, and values will be different than what it is here at Carleton. And so you're really trying to make sure that you're aligning with all what your campus partners are doing, what your institution is wanting to do, your strat plans, and making sure that you are part of the bigger picture of what's happening at your institution. And one of the ways that you do that is by collecting all of those great artifacts or documents, kind of like your strat plan and things that are happening with sustainability or equity, and then also making sure that you have all the literature that's important to your institution when it comes to student learning and when it comes to student development and learning and things like that. And so that is kind of the what is the curricular approach. Do you want me to go into a few more things of like what that looks like with the 10 essential elements and things like that?
Yeah, why don't we start with the 10 essential elements and then Jay and I can kind of hop in
Yeah,
and ask some
I'm
questions.
curious to know more about what these elements are.
Sure.
This is like my only experience personally with like the curricular approaches. I think I attended some sort of a gathering of OACUO or something like that, where I believe it was Laurier presented like their FIRE model of
Yeah.
like residence curriculum, and that I found very interesting and engaging. But it was, it's not a short document. It's
Yeah.
so let's start with the essentials, Natalie, if you could.
Sure. So with the essentials, I try to think of it as like the big picture. So thinking about all those documents that I was talking about, and all those plans, all the literature, all the research, that's really important. So a good example that I can give is that we're starting to do a review of our curriculum in the next couple of weeks. And for us, that's close to 30 documents that we're going to be going through to pull out themes and making sure that we're in alignment with what our institution is wanting to do. So that first essential element is connected to the archaeological dig. So that's number one. The number two is then you think about your educational priority. So you do your dig, and then these themes will kind of bubble up for you, and your priority kind of guides you for everything else that you're going to do. So you spend some time crafting your priority and making sure that all that you're doing is connected to research and literature. So that one is number three. Then
Okay.
from your priority that you crafted, you kind of break it down so it's a little bit easier to kind of, I guess, execute or implement into learning goals. And those can be the themes that you're kind of coming to when you're doing your archaeological dig, and then you kind of chunk them off into learning goals that you think are appropriate. The other part, or the next essential element, is that programming in our events, which is what you would normally think of for community development, is one tool that you can do. So you're still going to do programming, you're still going to do events and residents, but it's not the only tool. So things like roommate agreements or community hours or community meetings or how you receive somebody at your residence reception desk. Those are all tools for learning. It just doesn't have to be programmed anymore. And it's the idea that anything where there's an opportunity for learning can be a strategy as part of your curricular approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then from there, we start thinking about student staff as partners. So that's the next essential element. And I always say this when I'm talking to our student staff and we're talking about curriculum, that they know what is hip and happening. And as soon as I say what is hip and happening, that makes it so that I'm no longer hip and happening. But really, they know what is trendy. They know what is going to get our students' attention. So we can come up with all these great plans, but if we're not reaching our students, then that's not really helpful. So our student staff really are partners in making sure that we're reaching the students, we're doing it in a way that is approachable, and seeing it as a really good relationship with our student staff to make sure that they're the ones that are the feet on the ground and getting that information to them. Another
I'm glad
way,
that's an essential.
yeah,
I
totally,
really
right?
am. Like, I think that's like such a key element is understanding that, you know, we're not necessarily the people who know what's up anymore.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that in finding out what is important to our students and how are we going to reach them, and you know, things that might have been important to students, you know, a couple of years ago or even 6 months ago isn't relevant anymore, right? And so
Oh yeah.
you need your student staff to be able to tell you what's working, what's not working, where did you miss the mark, and being able to have this really collaborative relationship with them, or else it's just not going to work. You just you need them to make it be successful for sure.
Yeah.
Then the next essential element really connects to being sequenced and scaffolded. And the best way that I can describe that is that what you're going to do with your students in September is going to look very different to what you're going to do in residence in April, right? Like your students have changed, your staff has changed, the context has changed. So you want to make sure that it's sequenced throughout the year. And then the same thing goes for when you're thinking about the types of students that you have. So strategies that you would do with first year students are going to look very different than those who are in fourth year, right? And so not only are you taking into consideration what's happening in the academic year, you're taking into consideration what's happening during their entire academic career. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And then go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's great because, you know, a fourth year student, if they're still in residence, probably has much different goals than a first year student who's in residence. If you're in fourth year and you're in residence, you're usually fairly academically focused in my experience, and you want the convenience of being on campus, and you've already had your opportunity to meet people and have your, you know, traditions and I want to say, you know, the things you do regularly are already set in place. So your needs are much different than someone who's coming in and being integrated into a new community for the first time.
Absolutely. And if you try to do a first year strategy with a fourth year student, they're not going to want to do it, right? Like that,
No.
it's not what they are wanting or needing. And so you really have to make sure that you're gearing your strategies and how you implement a curricular approach based on the students you're trying to reach.
You mentioned some there that I want to cover at some point in time, but
Yep.
the importance of, you know, they're not going to want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
How do we ensure that we're getting that engagement to make sure that our curricular approach and all this work and effort that we're putting in is something that the people in residence are actually buying into? Because,
Yeah.
you know, the difference between being in a course and part of like that course curriculum is there is, you know, an expectation that you're following through and completing that. And if you don't, then that has significant consequences to yourself personally, both in like financial time and not completing the education that you're looking for. But in residence, it's very much voluntary.
Yep.
Outside of that for the most part, or I think that's the approach most institutions would take, is that it's, you know, participation by choice.
Right. Do you want me to talk about that now? I can.
If you'd like, if you feel like it's a natural thing
Sure.
to go to, we can jump into that.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that like has always struck me as like this seems so amazing, but the one difference between this curriculum and like a regular curriculum
Yeah.
that you'd experience in academia is that you're not required to participate in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And participation, as we know, with like programming at its basic level, is something that we struggle with on a regular basis. So how do
Absolutely.
we encourage that
Yeah.
and support it?
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to what I was talking about, where programming can be a tool, but it's not your only tool, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about students who maybe don't want to participate, there's other ways to reach them. And so what we talk about here is that we try to avoid what we call one and dones. So let's say you have a community meeting and you're, doing this activity and an event and that sort of thing, but there's students who don't show up, right? Like not every single student on every floor is going to show up to every single community meeting. That's just not going to happen, right?
Do they all show up even to the first one?
I know. So when we think of like, okay, what happens if we do this meeting and some people don't show up? You have to get the information and you have to have a different way of connecting them, right? So maybe one way that we do it is that there is a bulletin board. So let's take roommate agreements as a really good example of this like one and done thing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had a bulletin board on your floor that talks about residence information and how to live with your roommate, that's one way that you're going to do that. You know that in a couple of days there's going to be a community meeting that's also going to talk about living with your roommate and conflict and at the same time promoting maybe a residence-wide event. So what we do here, we do the roommate game as a big residence-wide event every year when it's not COVID, and thinking of it as more like a game where the roommates can say how well they know each other and things like that. And so they're all connected, right? So if somebody missed the community meeting but can see the bulletin board, or they see the bulletin board and they want to go to the roommate game as a residence-wide event, we're sprinkling this learning, right? Because that's what the curricular approach is about, is that you're sprinkling the learning throughout those strategies. It's not just a one community meeting, here's where the roommate information is. You're getting it to them in a variety of different ways, so that it's not just reliant on one thing. And so that would be one way that a curriculum can actually help reach the students rather than just relying on programming.
I like the sprinkling because
Yeah.
I always feel like that like first mandatory air quotes community meeting is like a sledgehammer to the face of students, where it's just like, here is 6,000 pounds of information, ram it into your head please and retain it all because we'll be expecting you to know it. P.S. Hope you're having fun.
Totally, right? And so and
Really?
they don't always get all that information, right? You're shoving it
No.
to them, but it's not always creeping in.
Well, it's like overeating, right? Like
Yeah.
if you can only digest so much, and then your body is forcefully expelling it.
Yep.
And that works the same with information, though. It does. Like your brain can only take so much in, and then the rest is just it's lost. So
Yeah.
what is the point, and why do we do it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would say that's one way to answer your question, Jay, about what happens if people don't show up or aren't participating, is that you're trying to come at them in several different ways. So that's one way. And then the other way is to try to think of being creative with what your strategies are. And so for us, it may be that we need to rethink when we're having students always come to us. Like you're coming to a community meeting, you're coming to a residence-wide event, but there's times where you actually need to go to them. And for us, that means connecting them and doing res fellow chats or intentional conversations where you're knocking on their door and interacting with them, doing community walks and actually being in their community. And our strategy is called floor walks and door knocks, where you're promoting different information or doing quizzes and saying like, hey, I have these prizes and I want to give this away and that sort of thing, that you're not always relying on them coming to you, but that you are going to them with the information and doing the activities with them as you're going into their communities. It's really shifting how you're trying to reach students, and making sure that you're not just relying on programming and events, and you're doing it in a different way. Does that help?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I want to be mindful of time. You were
Yep.
on sequenced and scaffolding. I know we're going through the core tenets of the curriculum, and the curricular approach is it's so meaty that our goal of a 30-minute episode might be a little lofty. But I do want to give us a chance to sort of work through that and then have some conversations about what it has looked like in practice, how schools can
Sure.
adopt it.
Yes.
So resuming on point 8, I believe.
Yep. I have
There we
two
go.
more. So one is connecting with your campus partners and really identifying who those stakeholders are. And when you have a curricular approach and you're thinking about your campus partners, there may be relationships that you have with campus partners that will be amplified because you're seeing these new connections that you can make with them versus some that maybe you call them partnerships, but they were actually just, sponsorship or things that you just did to help promote them. And so having those conversations with those campus partners and making sure that the ones that you're working with are at the table as you're developing this and who are your stakeholders and doing that. And then the last one is really thinking about your assessment and your cycle of improvement and that you're always planning and then observing what is working, you're discussing and then making those adjustments and course corrections and then planning again. So yeah, it's the other part that I really like about a curricular approach is you're really in the realm of continuous improvement and seeing what's working and what's not working and always just trying to make those tweaks and adjustments as you go so that the students have a really great experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, so those, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I did want to ask about the continuous improvement piece.
Yeah.
In your context at Carleton, how often are you reviewing the curriculum? What does this continuous improvement piece look like? I think in my context, we will perhaps have the meeting at the end of the semester of like, how did all of this go? What do we want to keep? What do we not? But I
Yep.
don't. At times, I wonder if that's frequently enough.
Sure. So we every year we pick certain strategies and certain learning outcomes that will be assessed that year. And we are really fortunate. We have a position here that really oversees all of our assessment here at Carleton. And so she's really helpful in making sure that if the strategy is coming up, what is the assessment that we're going to do? The student staff and our residence managers collect all that information and then pass it on to her, and then kind of sends it out to us and says, "This worked. This didn't. Do we need to adjust the course for the next strategy that's coming up?" And then collects it all for us. And so there's these like in the moment sort of assessment that we're doing and adjustments that we're doing, and then thinking about bigger picture. We talk about it every year, so we're always in this cycle. So in November, we're starting to think about what our curriculum is going to be in September, next September 2021. And already having those conversations of this worked, this didn't work, we have to remember this. And it's kind of almost taking a running list of the things that you want to change and making sure that those are being adapted. If you can, if there's stuff that we know isn't working right now, we will change it for the winter, right? Or is this a future problem where we're kind of doing more of a review? And so it's kind of making sure that for us, curriculum comes up every week at our supervisory team meeting of what worked, what didn't, what's coming down the pipe, and making sure that it's part of our everyday. I don't know if that answers your question, Ryan, or not.
No, it totally does. I think I've had some experience with the curricular approach, and I've always asked myself, what is the sweet spot of how you're evaluating and how do you kind of sequence in the assessment and what do you do with the assessment?
Yep.
Because I think something that I've struggled with is when we're assessing in the summer, it's been a long 8 months, and I do not remember what happened in September.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for us, the way that we've done it is because we're doing the assessment and we're talking about it, it's really important for us to give it back to our student staff as well to say, hey, you did this, a couple weeks ago. Here's what we've learned. Thank you for doing it. And here's how we're going to change it for next time. So our student staff can see that, they're doing all this work with the assessment, that it's not just sitting in a binder on a shelf somewhere, right? And it's collecting dust, that we're actually using it and that it's meaningful and it's valuable, and it's timely.
I think that brings us into a pretty good talking point transition area for asking ourselves now, like, given that we've dealt with this past 8 months,
Yeah.
how has the curricular approach held up and been affected by like COVID-19 as a pandemic? Because earlier you spoke about, the door-to-door knocking and taking the curriculum to the residents or the students wherever they may be, kind of
Yep.
thing, as us connecting with them directly, in as an alternative to just simply like programs and events and things,
Mm-hmm.
which is already, I find, very difficult with the student staff of the modern age kind of thing. They're
Yeah.
they're less face to face and they're more like social media. So maybe those skills that they've developed have actually helped them. Maybe they've hindered them. What has your experience been with it?
Yeah, I think that when COVID-19 started, at least for us in the whole world in March, um, having a curricular approach was actually a strength of ours. And there were times when we were talking about what was happening in our communities and planning for September, that I would say to our team, I'm really glad that this is the approach we're taking because we've already done a lot of the hard work. We already knew what was really important to us. We already knew what worked and what didn't. And we had these ideas that needed some tweaking and they needed some adjusting, but at the core, we were able to get there. And so what I mean by that is for us, conversations with students is really important. And that was never going to go away. It was how do we make those different? If we were, here in residence, but if there was a reason why a residence fellow couldn't go face to face with them, can we do them virtually instead? Can we do them with physical distance instead? Can we have them in a lounge rather than in a bedroom? And so those were the conversations that we were having, but we already knew what was really important to us, and we just kind of had to change the method of our delivery. And I think the other thing that was helpful for us is changing our focus from these residence wide sort of events and programming. We'd already been starting those shifts and actually, like I said before, bringing our connections and bringing our staff to the students. So even now, when we're doing floor walks and door knocks, we can do that in a different way that's safe and making sure that we're still physically distanced, we're still wearing our masks, we're still doing the hand sanitizing and all that kind of stuff, but you can still see in person a student, right? We're not just talking about virtual, we're talking about that human connection, and making sure that that's still really important to us, and in doing that. So I was actually really glad that we had already kind of shifted to a curriculum when the pandemic hit, because we knew what was essential, we knew where we needed to put our energy, and it was just the tweaking that needed to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Has there been any feedback from either like students or student staff in regards to changes that might be made, in regards to the difference this sort of year versus others that have kind of affected your curriculum in any significant way?
I don't think not so much of the changes, and I think we have been adjusting as we go, which is the other part. It's you have this plan, and then all these things are changing. So being here in
Mhm.
Ottawa, we're in modified stage 2, right? And so we had to do some tweaking and think of, like, we may not always be able to be face to face with our students. Even when it was coming to August training, it was, what's our backup plan and that sort of thing. But I think people, our students and our student staff, appreciate that the core stays the same, of that conversation, the connections, and making sure that people are looking out for each other, and that we really wanted to make sure that if a student was coming here, they still felt like they belonged in our community. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for that human connection and that sense of belonging, and making sure that we're still giving that community to them.
Great. Thank
Oh,
you.
that's really
Yeah.
Yeah.
cool. Natalie, I'm curious. I know you've historically had really strong buy-in with a lot of your campus partners, and you talked about it actually being a partnership,
Yeah.
and not just sponsorship.
Yeah.
Have they continued to join with the actual visits into residence and all of that?
Uh, like during the pandemic.
Yeah, because I know at least what I've seen online in the past is they've actually been a part of some of your door knocking campaigns, if I'm remembering correctly, right?
Not for us. So
No?
our campus partners haven't done that for us, but
Okay.
they have been. We do work with them for our residence-wide activities and bringing out some of the bigger activities with our campus partners for
Hmm.
sure.
Okay.
But to answer your question, Ryan, I think the answer is yes. They they still have or we still have a really good partnership with them because our students are here, right? Like they're here, they're in Ottawa, they're in campus, they're living in residence, especially during a pandemic when so many students are virtual and not even in the same town. We have this kind of captive audience here in residence. So it feels like at some points in time that everybody wants to connect with resident students because they're here,
Hmm.
and it's making sure that we're managing that overload as well at the same time.
So I do wanna, before we get too close to sort of the end of our podcast here, just talk a little bit. What are some tips and tricks for people who maybe are looking at implementing the curricular approach, or perhaps have already sort of implemented something,
Yeah,
or haven't at all even heard of this necessarily, and think it's like a neat thing that gives a little bit of guidance and structure to what they're trying to do throughout the year, that you would offer to people who are trying to accomplish something like this, or do take the first steps into creating something at their own institution? Because I know there's many out there who have not adopted a
yeah.
curricular approach and might be interested.
I would say for like tips and tricks is making sure that you're willing to invest the time and the energy to do it. It's not something that you can just do in an afternoon and say like, "Hey, we're good to go." It does take a lot of time, and it takes time with your team. But the benefits kind of outweigh that time because you gain so much clarity of what's important to you and what's valuable to you. Um, and you will have tough conversations with your team when you're trying to achieve that clarity. But investing the time and not doing any of the like shortcuts, celebrating those small wins. So when you do have your educational priority or when you do have your learning goals, making sure that you're celebrating that you've got that far. Yes, there's still so much to do, but the small wins are really helpful. Um,
Hmm.
Another sort of thing that a lot of people talk about is making sure that you launch at, like they say, launch at 40%. Like it doesn't have to be perfect, and sometimes good is good enough. And because the curricular approach always has that built-in um, part of continuous improvement, that there's always something that you can change. There's always something that you will need to get better. But at some point in time, you just have to do it and see what the issues are, see what the challenges are, and then go back to the drawing board and start making those tweaks and stuff, that sort of thing. So um, the tip for that would be is start it and know that you're going to have to continuously have these conversations.
Hmm.
I think the other part is what we were talking about earlier is making sure that you see your student staff as partners, that they're part of this journey with you. And for us, a really big uh, tip, I would say, or a thing that worked in our favor is making sure that we got buy-in from our returners, because they're
Hmm.
the ones that, um, the change management piece, right? They start one year and then there's these changes and then there's the next year, that you're really, really engaging any of your leadership positions when it comes to student staff or your returners so that they can be advocates for you when you're not in the room as well too. And so spending that time with your returners is really key in making this work with your student staff for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely agree. Absolutely agree with that. It's good to bring them in and have them as people who feel invested in what you're doing and are leading by example.
Yeah, for sure. And then they feel valued, right? They feel like they're being heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Natalie, a question that I have for you now is thinking about some of our listeners who are not currently adopting. I know your first tip is start it, be
Yeah,
okay launching with a perhaps 40% completed, or
yeah,
understanding that there is this continuous improvement. If we
yeah.
have folks that are sitting here listening to the episode and they're like, I do want to start a curricular approach at our institution,
Mhm.
where would you direct them to start? I mean, we have our 10 tenets, but where do they
Yep,
find more information? How do they kind of get themselves in a position to start?
That
sure.
was a good question, Ryan. That was a great question.
I think I have a two-part answer to that question. I think there's the logistic part and the like philosophical part. So philosophically, I would say even before you start a curricular approach, is having some conversations on your team about why. Why do you do the job that you do? What's important to you in residence? What is that those core values, right? Like getting everybody on the same page of knowing your why. And the other sort of shift is: are you talking about student learning on your teams? Are you talking about being an educator? Are you talking about that big picture philosophical sort of reasons why you do your role? So I would start with that even before you talk about curriculum. Once you've had those conversations, then you're talking about more of the logistics side. So it could be things like going to the Institute of Curricular Approach, reading articles like Beyond Seat Time or All Educators Educating. There's a brand new book that came out this past summer called The Curricular Approach to Student Affairs. And it's kind of like your go-to guide for creating a curricular approach, and it has great resources and chapters that would be helpful for anybody. And I think just connecting with other colleagues who are doing this work to find out what worked for them, what didn't, and things like that. But I would start with some of the kind of articles and books that are out there if you're logistically wanting to do it, and going to ICA. Yeah.
That's excellent. We always like to provide anyone listening with a great list of resources and things that they can check out on their own. So
Yeah,
thank you for having a few of those for people to look into. And
absolutely.
maybe when we post this, we'll try and add those some of the links and things that you mentioned there to the end of it, just in case anyone in the description of our video, it'll be posted on YouTube at least. We can have a look there, and hopefully we can set up some of those links for you for quick access. But is there any, as we sort of come up to the end of the episode here, is there anything that you want to leave the people with as just I don't know, end point for knowledge or your experience with the curricular approach? Some parting words in regards to it?
I think my parting words is it's really helpful because it provides you clarity in what you try to do and what you're wanting to do with your students or for your students. And it, especially during what the next couple of years might bring, having that clarity is really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that it certainly does. I always enjoyed the curricular approach because even though I never got to participate in some of it, it was a little bit difficult when you worked on like smaller teams and things to really get the resources put together to make something. Because as you say, like there can be a lot of supporting documents and things available.
Yeah.
But it's something that I always strive for, was to at least take some kind of insights from places that have implemented the curricular approach, because it just gives you a little bit of structure and
Mm-hmm.
things that you can really gauge your sort of success off of throughout the year, and gives you some points to talk about in terms of what might need changing. So I do really support it as an idea, and think it's a fantastic thing that some institutions are lucky enough to be doing, and hopefully this helps others get involved.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's incredible, and I know every institution it's always going to look different. And I've been at
Yeah.
a handful of different institutions where I ask, "What does your curriculum look like?" And I see a bunch of different documents that always it's not one templated form, which is nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone's got their own spin on it. So, if one of the places that you can also look is just, and I think Natalie mentioned it there, is connect with some other institutions who might have done it before, just people who are working within that, and see what they've done. There are certainly, I believe the curricular approach is definitely growing in popularity and being adopted more and more as each year passes. But we'll leave you with that for today, because that's all the time that we have for right now. So thank you so much, Natalie, for joining both Ryan and I and having this conversation and educating us on your various experiences that you've had. It's been
You
a
are
pleasure.
most welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Not
and
a problem.
if you want to continue the conversation on this topic, feel free to reach out to Natalie at Natalie Allan at carleton.ca. That's Natalie dot Allan, Allan, at carleton.ca. Or you can get a hold of myself at ryan.doherty at ryerson.ca or jay at audioacuho at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you if you are interested in the podcast. Thanks to everybody for being a part of today.
Yeah, and it's been good to hear all of you, and we're looking forward to our next episode and joining you again in another month. So that's all for Audio Akuo.